Before the festival of the Passover, Jesus knew that his hour had come to depart from this world and go to the Father. Having loved his own who were in the world, he loved them to the end. The devil had already put it into the heart of Judas, son of Simon Iscariot, to betray him. And during supper, Jesus, knowing that the Father had given all things into his hands, and that he had come from God and was going to God, got up from the table, took off his outer robe, and tied a towel around himself. Then he poured water into a basin and began to wash the disciples' feet and to wipe them with the towel that was tied around him. He came to Simon Peter, who said to him, "Lord, are you going to wash my feet?" Jesus answered, "You do not know now what I am doing, but later you will understand." Peter said to him, "You will never wash my feet." And Jesus answered, "Unless I wash you, you have no share with me." Simon Peter said to him, "Lord, not my feet only, but also my hands and my head." Jesus said to him, One who has bathed does not need to wash, except for the feet, but is entirely clean. You are clean, though not all of you." For he knew who was to betray him, and for this reason he said, "Not all of you are clean." After he had washed their feet, put on his robe, and returned to the table, Jesus said to them, "Do you know what I have done to you? You call me teacher and Lord, and you are right, for that is what I am. So if your Lord and teacher have washed your feet, you also ought to wash one another's feet. For I have set you an example, that you also should do as I have done to you." The Gospel of the Lord.
Praise to you, Lord Jesus Christ. This evening, with our liturgy, we begin our celebration of the Sacred Triduum of the 3 days that mark the central components, really the heart of what our belief gives to us as Catholics and as Christians. And tonight we begin this celebration with the Mass of the Last Supper and the importance of all the things that Jesus does for us. And we know when we path out for ourselves exactly where we're going and what the meaning of things be for us. And as the psalmist said from many centuries before, a people that rejoices needs to appreciate and understand the reason for their joy. And that's what we do tonight, and our prayer and our reflection continuing throughout these days. Jesus tonight institutes the gift of himself. He institutes the gift of the Eucharist, which we celebrate so frequently, and most especially on the first day of the week on Sunday morning to mark his rising. But he institutes also and recognizes a priesthood that all the faithful share, an ability to offer their lives with Christ on the altar in the midst of the Eucharist, altar in the Mass that we celebrate and participating in it, but also in the world in which we live by offering their lives. And in order to do that, and to leave his sign of that and the power of that in the Church for the rest of time before he returns again, he institutes a priesthood, a sacred priesthood, with a power to confect the Eucharist, which we celebrate tonight. the gift of the Eucharist itself and the instrument of the priesthood that has been given to the Church to be able to celebrate Mass, confect the Eucharist, the very body and blood of the Lord, and for the faithful to be able to receive the gift to go out into the world, but also to offer their lives on the altar with Christ and ourselves back to the Father in the perfect sacrifice in which our baptism calls us. Jesus institutes that by telling the disciples, "This bread now, this is my body. This wine, this is my blood, which is poured out for you." And Paul speaks to the faithful, teaching them, this is what he said at this Last Supper before his death, the night before he died. Before he dies, he does a remarkable thing, which is so important for us to appreciate. He takes off his garment and washes the feet of the disciples, and he does something that teaches them of who he is. The sign of washing the feet is one of the lowest possible things that a person can do. And that's why Peter objects so vehemently. "Lord, you cannot wash my feet." It's one of the lowest things that someone can do with the filth that is part of someone's feet from walking in the dust and all the dirt that the people walk in. But the washing of the feet is his incarnation. The fact that God is born of the Virgin, what we celebrate at Christmas time, is the absolute humility of God himself to enter into our condition in everything we share with us except one thing, which is sin. God and Jesus makes this act of humility which is so startling it's beyond our comprehension. And a sign of that only is washing the feet of the disciples. It is a sign of something far greater, of his very incarnation and of his very living among us and sharing all the infirmities that we have except for sin. The sign will reach its consummation tomorrow that we celebrate. He will not just wash feet in a sign of humility with the absolute humility within his soul and heart, but he will give his life, the very consummation of giving everything that he has, as we spoke of earlier in the week, in his love for us, a consuming love that consumes the offering itself in his very death that we'll celebrate tomorrow, knowing full well in our faith that it leads to the resurrection, which will be the joy of our celebrations for the next weeks ahead. But this step is so fundamental. Peter, wisely and rightly, because he speaks so instinctively, says, "Lord, you can't do this. You're our master and our teacher. We not just look up to you, we know who you are." And Jesus says to them, "Unless you let me do this, you can have no share with me." And that is a powerful statement for us as we enter into these days of Jesus' sacrifice, of his death, and of his resurrection. Unless you let me do this for you, unless you accept the fact that I've become incarnate and I'm going to give my life in love for you, unless you take that into your heart, you can have no part of me. You can have no share with me. And the share is what we celebrate at Easter time when we proclaim, and those will be baptized at the Easter Vigil, is the very baptism that we have. It allows us to enter into the very nature of Christ's sacrifice. Unless you let me wash your feet, you will have no share in the proper baptism of what it really is to be baptized. Because to be baptized is to be of the lowest, humblest place and serving the community and being of a torn and broken and contrite heart that is able to give one's life completely in love as I do. That's the joy we celebrate, but think of the challenge of what our baptism means. It means to give of ourselves as Christ does. And we will watch that tomorrow as we do year after year, knowing of the victory of the resurrection, but knowing the extent and the limits, the unconditional love that is there in what he does tomorrow in giving his life for us. That is what he wants us to have a share in. That's what he does by washing our feet. That's what he allows us in the humility of our baptism that is given to us. And the reason for that rejoicing with us is that we know by being humble within ourselves, we have a share with Christ, but we have the fullness of humanity as well. The one thing that kills our humanity is our pride. And this sign that Jesus gives to us is the perfect antidote and medicine for fallen humanity that relies on its pride and becomes enamored with its pride and is killed by its pride. And we will see in what he does in these days and tonight in this sign of washing feet of how low he is willing to go in salvation for us, watching his death tomorrow and knowing of the glory of his resurrection.